and I will be able to hit on new. And so in this file, what we will have to do is the elements that we already have over here in English. And let me go ahead and copy this root. And actually from the root, I won't need these headers. So let me go ahead and remove them. But all of these data elements will have to be translated. So each translator for each of the languages will have to translate the value. The name has to remain the same. This is the identifier that will be used to know the strings for each of the supported languages. And the comment is never going to be displayed and should never really be changed, because this is how the translator is going to know a little bit more context. The value is the only thing that has to change. So in here, let me go ahead and translate the name of my categories over to Spanish. And so once I have translated it, it's going to be ready for the application to use, or almost ready. Now, I do want to mention here one particular scenario that I just found where the comment is rather important. For all of the others, it's really not that important. The translation was very straightforward. But for the food category, I did need to know a little bit more context, so that is where the comment is going to be more important. The name in English is food, and for food, you could use the literal translation, but the literal translation, which is comida, is not really what I meant in here. This is more targeted to be related to nutrition. So by providing a little bit more context in the comment, the translator will be able to do a better job at translating the application. So of course, many different scenarios are going to apply for many different languages, which is why it's important that you add the comments for the translation to be more precise. So let's go ahead and use these resources that we already have. And what I will do is simply build my project first. And actually, I do need the headers in here, but once this is built, I will be able to come here to the categories, and instead of hard coding these values, use the resources that come from those app resources. So instead of writing or hard coding housing, I can go ahead and access app resources, which of course, because these are inside of a resources folder, I will need to add a using directive to that namespace. And from app resources, notice I have access to all of those names. So this one, for example, is going to be the housing category. Now notice that I do have auto-completion in here to all of those names from the data points, which may make it more clear why we need to set the same name for every single one of the languages. After all, this is the identifier. Xamarin Forms will then use the corresponding value depending on the language that we need to use. So let me just go ahead and set those resources instead of the hard-coded strings here in my categories. And I have done it here in the categories. I will also need to do it in the new expense VM, by the way. Here I have the same thing. So I will simply now access it from the app resources. Now my application is beginning to be translated. Now just a quick note in here, in this example, I am saving the name of the category in the expenses. So here, precisely in the new expense VM, when I insert one, I set the category to be the selected expense category, which may not be the best scenario. I may need to use the selected categories ID, because in this case, if I were to move from one language to the other, the category is no longer the same one. So if I added one in Spanish for alimentación, in English, it's not going to be food, so that category would not be listed. But it's just a quick note, it's not really related to this being translated. It's related to me not actually using an ID here when saving the expenses. But let's go ahead and take a look at the result. Remember that I changed the language for my simulator to Spanish, so automatically my simulator should already be using the name in Spanish for these categories. So let's take a look. As soon as this runs, we are now going to see those categories in Spanish being listed. But notice that now, if I go to expenses, I have one that still has the old category because of what I mentioned. I am saving each of the expenses with the category set to the expense category, which is pretty much the selected category. And I saved this one when this was still in English. So this is not something that I should be doing. And you can see how it's not accounted for in the same category. So I should probably be using a category ID instead. But you can see that the translation is happening. And we can see that in the new expense view as well. In the category picker, we see the categories in Spanish. Now, if you wanted to test in English, you could again go ahead and change the language on your simulator. I get that it is not that easy. It takes a bit. There is a more straightforward way to test it out. And what I will do is do it directly on the apps constructor. In the apps constructor, what I will do is force a specific language. And this is not something that you should do except when you're testing. But let me go ahead and access the app resources and set the culture to be a new culture info. And this is going to require, I can pass an integer, but let me go ahead and use a string in here and set this to English United States, which will mean that we are going to be using the English version of the translation, or in this case, the default one. So let's go ahead and run this now. And again, this is forcing a culture. This is something that you can do when you're testing, but this is something that you should remove as soon as you want to deploy to your users, because I'm overriding whatever value is being used. So now when the application runs, we're going to see the names of the categories in English, which is coming from the default translation, the default regex file. Again, for testing, this is going to be very handy. You don't have to go ahead and change the culture or the language in the simulator every single time for every single language. You can do it in here. Now, one thing to note in here, the default resources file is in English, which is why that is being used, but I don't really have a specific English version. When there is no specific version for the culture, then the default resources file is going to be used. But that means that English version, which is the default version, will also be used if, for example, the culture were set to Portuguese. So if I don't have a translation for Portuguese, the default translation is going to be used, which is English. If you are planning on deploying your application to a country that speaks Portuguese, it may be a better idea. And Portuguese is not PR, it's PT. So I was mentioning that it would be a good idea for you to actually provide resources for Portuguese. Because otherwise, as you're going to see, the language that is going to be used is going to be the default one, in this case, English. So something to keep in mind. And by the way, this could also be helpful if you have a language selector inside of your application and you want to use that selector instead of the language from the device. So if you, for example, have inside of your application the ability to select what language you want the application to be on, this is how you can change the culture very easily. Now, we are already successfully translating our application. If you go ahead and test this on iOS, it will work in exactly the same way. As you can see, I have set, without having to change the language of my simulator, the culture over to Spanish, and I see the Spanish version. But again, this is only for testing. When the application is actually running, you should not have this, which means the user will expect the application to have the language that is coming from their phones. Of course, what we still have to do is to implement the rest of the translations. And most of the translations, or some of the translations, are actually going to have to be implemented over on SAML. Because if we navigate to one of our views, let's say that we navigate over to the categories page, here there are some texts that we're actually setting directly from SAML. For example, the text of this label or the text of this button. So we would expect this to happen directly from SAML as well, so we don't have to access all of this from the code behind. So in the next lecture, we're going to learn how to make these translations directly from SAML as well, not just from C#. So we can start to translate those strings that we are currently setting from SAML, so we can eventually configure all of the translations for all of the strings that currently are hard-coded.